We will start with a panel discussion about the European position, the formation of new security geopolitical order. I see that we have our speakers here, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, I can see also Mr. Halas. Just one more minute or just few seconds so we can prepare the glasses, the waters. So we are setting the scene. I can see that speakers are ready and also the moderator. So I can see that the scene is settled already, so I would like to ask the speakers of our next panel discussion to take their seats. It means Carlota Garcia Encina, Mateusz Halas, Eric Morris, and the moderator of this panel discussion, Richard Józwiak from the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. And as I said, this time we will focus on the new security geopolitical order. And I can see that the panel is ready to start. So, Richard Józwiak, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pity that so many people left now, because we were talking about visions before, but now it's going to be something more exciting, positions. So, just don't get too excited yet. What we're going to talk about is, of course, the European position, geopolitical position in a new world order. And what I hope we're going to touch upon is perhaps the future of the transatlantic ties, always very important to Europe. Of course, we're going to talk about the global south, one of that sort of themes that have come up more and more. How the EU is positioning itself vis-a-vis that term global south, that I know is nothing homogeneous about that, but still for the point of reference we're going to use it. We're going to talk about perhaps the digital disruption and what that means for the European Union, meaning, in other words, something that is very popular here in Czech Republic, to talk about resilience. So how resilient is the European Union? And with me I have three excellent speakers, starting, of course, with the lady, Carlota Garcia Encina, from the Elcano Institute, expert especially on transatlantic relations. We start with you immediately. This is the sort of thing, we are in November right now, 2023. And in November 2024, there is an event that many Europeans are very afraid of, at least when I speak with people in Brussels and so on. How do you see this future of this transatlantic bond? Will it break?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, if I may, I would like to try to do some predictions about November 2024. I'm sure that I'm going to say something that just 1 or 2% of the audience is going to support. We have Trump. Maybe Trump can be the candidate of the Republican Party. We don't know yet, but if Trump is the Republican candidate, that's good news for Biden. Why? Because Biden won the elections in 2020, because Biden won the midterm elections in 2018, and because Biden won the elections in last November, the midterm elections. So 3 elections. And if we have a look to the polarization of the US, numbers didn't change that much. Democrats are not going to vote for a Republican president. Republicans are not going to vote for a Democratic president. So at the end, they are going to be the independents who are going to vote and to decide the next elections. And if you ask to the independents, they don't like Biden because of the age. But they don't like Trump either. So at the end, they are going to vote for Biden instead of Trump. So Trump is the candidate, good news for Biden. That's my bet. It is true that we can have another a Republican candidate, not anymore DeSantis, maybe Nikki Haley, and that's good news for Europe. So my point is, European countries are too much focused on the White House. If there's convergence with the White House, for example, we don't talk about European defense or strategic autonomy. If there is divergence with the White House, we're still talking and improve this strategic autonomy. Let's go back. I mean, let's think about the Bush administration. During that time, European countries were, talking about building a European defense. With the Obama administration, we stopped talking about that. But when Obama decided to pivot to Asia, we start talking about this European defense. With Trump, we improve all the steps to a European defense. With Biden, we stopped talking about strategic autonomy. With the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we restart talking about strategic autonomy. So Europe and the European countries have to do their job independently on who is in the White House, a Republican or a Democratic candidate. So I think that's what we need to follow. I mean, we need to do our job. We need to be less dependent. We need to reduce vulnerabilities, and we need to have the foreign policy tools in order to act according to our values and our interests.
I must admit that I was a very bad moderator starting off immediately, because before I would have given the floor to you, I was too excited. I should have said to all of you, in order to ask questions, you need to log in to Slido, put the passcode, and then ask the questions, and then upvote questions. So sorry about that. And now I'm going to ask follow-up questions. But let's still imagine, though, this is a hypothetical thing. Trump will be president next year. What are the 3 things you would say to European leaders? What are the 3 policy advices you would give? You talk about, strategic autonomy, boost defense, and so on. But concretely, how should the European prepare for the potential transatlantic disaster that is awaiting us in a year's time?
When I talk about transatlantic relationship, I think on 3 pillars. It is about the relationship between the European Union and Washington. It's about NATO, and it's about the bilateral relationship. I mean, the 3 of them are interconnected. So with the Trump administration, looking back to the first Trump administration, he was much more focused on the bilateral relationship instead of the multilateral relationship, or or trying to cooperate with the European Union. So if Trump is the next president, he's gonna try to deal just with each country, each capital of Europe, and I would like to say to the European countries that don't do that. I mean, we try to, we need to be united and try to avoid that maybe some countries would like to take advantage of this thing and try to deal just bilaterally with the US. And I think it's not time for that. I mean, you have that bilateral relationship, we need to improve our unity.
Okay, so that's the unity is the one thing, but again, I mean, sure, that's a nice word, but then, I can think about, certain countries in the European Union, and not mentioning names, I would think, a bilateral relationship with Washington would suit me perfectly. What's preventing them from doing that and ignoring a potential common EU position, if there ever is one?
No, I think it's very important. I mean, we have to take to have a good bilateral relationship. We need to be also a reliable ally of NATO, and we have to be a strong member of the European Union. I mean, the 3 pillars are very important. We have to improve the 3 pillars. But if we just focus on the bilateral relationship and not in the other one, I mean, I think that's the problem. We need to work on the 3 of them.
Let's move perhaps a bit to to Central Europe now, may I say so. Matusz Halasz from the Institute of International Relations here in Prague. You heard Carlotta speak a lot about transatlantic relationship, but of course other relationships as well to determine the EU's new potentially geopolitical position. What other key relationships are there, and how should the European Union or the EU, Europe, navigate through this?
First, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I think for Europe, besides the relationship with the United States and Washington, there are two key players that will determine the landscape globally, and that's China on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. We need to plan with a very long perspective ahead. I think that the bad relations with Moscow will prevail for decades. It will not be a matter of a couple of years. We will not get back to normal. I think that we need to count on the fact that the bad relations between the European Union, the West, and Russia will be like that for many, many years to come. That's first. The second is the really superpower competition, if you want, between the Beijing and Washington. I think naturally Washington has a lead here, and since we are members of the same community of countries, we need to help each other. The future will depend to a large extent on the outcome of the war in Ukraine that is going on. On the outcome of that war, there are many possibilities. There is an option of the US shifting more and more attention towards in the Pacific, and the Europeans being in a need to take care of their own security environment to an increasing degree. But it really depends on how the war will end and what will be the outcome. So these two factors are crucial for the future, I think.
You mentioned the outcome of the war, and that's going to be crucial. But then again, what if there isn't an outcome? What if this war becomes frozen, which probably looks like the most realistic scenario right now? What then?
I think that's the outcome as well. I mean, it might be the armistice, it might be no armistice, it might be a ceasefire, it might be no ceasefire, it might be frozen conflict. That's one of the possible options that we have to consider as well. So.
And how do you see Europe then in that sort of potential likely scenario? What should the EU, Europe do in case there isn't a clear winner in this conflict?
I don't think that we are currently at the stage when we are able to think through that. We are not doing that. The thing is that if there will be a ceasefire or decrease of intensity of hostilities in coming years, maybe months, I don't know. If there will be a frozen conflict, we need to think about how to prevent future conflicts between Ukraine and between Kiev and Moscow, between Russia and Ukraine. How to prevent reiteration of wars, like we witnessed during the second half of the 20th century in the Middle East between the Arab countries and Israel. The only real remedy to that disease of repeated conflicts is credible deterrence. The only thing I can imagine to achieve that is the integration of Ukraine into NATO. But then the question mark is how to integrate Kiev into NATO if there is a frozen conflict on the territory of Ukraine. I don't think that anyone has an answer to that.
So, of course, EU-NATO enlargement seems to be a potential answer to it, but for that to be credible, what time frames are we talking about here? I know it's very difficult to predict this sort of thing, but something needs to happen, and for that to happen as well, especially EU enlargement, there is considerable reforms needed in the EU as well to welcome new members. So how should European countries, because it is about European countries to a large extent, play on this? Like, what should be their goal going forward? 5 years, 10 years, and so on.
I'm a big fan of prudent planning. First things first. You would not introduce euro without the Maastricht criteria. You will not implement four liberties, a common market, without a single European Act. In my world, you will not enlarge the EU/NATO without clear outcome of the conflict in Ukraine. You need to do first thing first. Solve the war, win the war, and then think about the next step.
Eric Maurice from the Robert Schuman Foundation, an old Brussels face, if I may say so. Welcome to Prague.
Thank you.
You've now heard about both potential NATO-EU enlargement, about transatlantic ties, how difficult they could be. Your thoughts on this? It's already quite a lot to pick up on, and we haven't even come to Global South or digital disruption yet, so a lot to unpack. What's your initial thoughts?
Well, on Ukraine, I would agree with what has been said, that we need an outcome well, there were discussions today on that, on enlargement, on neighborhood policy, but of course, if the war drags on, if it becomes a frozen conflict with still, I think it's 17% of Ukrainian territory being occupied, but the question will be there, even if Ukraine does everything which is needed to close all the enlargement chapters. The big question will be which Ukraine will join the EU. Can it be a Ukraine with a territory, a part of its territory being occupied? And that's the big question, and it hasn't been asked yet, of course, because it's too early for that. But at some point, it will have to be asked if there is no decisive military breakthrough in this war. And as long as this neighborhood question has not been addressed, I was going to say it's difficult for the EU to have a larger strategy. But at the same time, the world is moving on, and we are talking about the European position, and I think it's a very uncomfortable position in the world today, because I see three big trends. They are not the only ones, but three that are very challenging for the EU. The first one is the contestation of the international order and multilateralism. The second one would be the promotion of alternative narratives, alternative values, especially about democracy. When you look at the China-Russia declaration in Shanghai, I think it was in Shanghai a few days before the invasion of Ukraine, what was striking is the whole definition of democracy was just reversed, was subverted by these two countries, and that's a very big challenge for the EU, which is based on democracy. And the third trend is rearmament of powers, and of course the EU hasn't done that. It's not meant to do that, and then it relates to the policies of its member states. So this rules-based order is the world in which the EU could develop itself and could have a global policy, but it's more and more unstable, and the EU is maybe the less equipped to address that. And it is I cannot say the country, I cannot say the power, which is also part of the problem, but the entity which has the more to lose on this evolution of the world order. So my views are that first, the EU should, of course, address and resolve as much as possible the instability in its neighborhood, mainly in Ukraine and Western Balkans. So it has become an internal policy with enlargement. It's not only now, it's no more only a neighborhood or external policy. It has become an internal policy which raises a lot of new questions and challenges for the EU, mainly reforms and institutional reforms and budget. And at the same time, the EU leaders, because all comes from them, should start thinking of, well, maybe it's a ground term, but of a global strategy of what they want the EU to what is the aim of the EU, not just enlargement or the end of the war or competitiveness. That is part of a larger strategy, but there is still no clear definition of what the EU wants to achieve for itself and on the world stage. And I think that's probably the biggest and the more complicated challenge for the years to come.
So, a bit provocative, but according to you, what should be the aim of the EU on the world stage? And should it even have an aim at all? Should it be a global player?
Well,
can it be a global player?
Yeah, until now, the EU was... it was basically Angela Merkel's view when she was asked what the EU was and what was the purpose of the EU. She said it's a single market. We have to play or to use the strength of the single market. But that's not enough today, because protecting or promoting the single market is one thing, but it's not like that. It's not with protecting the single market that you get support for Ukraine, that you defend yourself if there is hybrid attacks against the EU or destabilization in the neighborhood. It's not like that you can speak on equal terms with China, for instance. Of course, you can play on trade. You can say you are a big trading partner, but that's not enough for the Chinese. Since the aim of China is to get much more than being an economic power, and if you have no sense of what you want to project, if you do not agree not only on how to decide on your positions, but which positions you should have on the world stage, on the big issues of the day. I mean, Israel-Hamas is one of these examples. It's the biggest challenge next to Ukraine of these days. And I mean, we have the Commission President, the EU leaders, the High Representative saying different things. So more than a month after the start of this crisis, we still don't know what the EU wants on this crisis. What is the position of the EU on that? And so you cannot be a global player if on each crisis you're not able to say this is what the EU thinks, this is how the EU wants to, this is what the EU wants to achieve, and this is how it wants to achieve it. And we don't have that. We have that for Ukraine, more or less, and because there are still uncertainties on that. And we don't have that absolutely not on Israel-Hamas, for instance.
It seems like you almost want to say the dreaded F word here. Some sort of federation, European federation, in a sense. Huh? Like, it seems like, I mean, like, in the end, that seems like, I know you're not saying it, but it seems like when you're pointing out the difference here, it's sort of like in order for the EU to speak with one voice, well, then it can't be 27 different foreign policies, for example. It has to be one foreign policy. So,
well, do
you dare to say it?
No.
United States of Europe, is that the answer?
I'm not sure. That's the problem, because I think we are in between from at least 2 decades, when all this momentum from the Single Act to the Amsterdam Treaty, we had a lot of changes, a lot of federalism coming in with Euro, with Schengen, with a lot of new policies. And then there was the attempt to have a constitution, which was rejected by France and the Netherlands. And since then, there is no momentum for going forward, going deeper into integration. We have reaction to crisis. So we have new tools, we have new processes. After the Euro crisis, financial crisis, Brexit was also a big show of unity. We have new developments with the war in Ukraine, especially on defense, of course. But nobody is ready to take the big jump to federalism. Public opinions would not allow that, and we would need 27 ratifications, and a lot of countries would not escape referendums on that. So it is the discussion that leaders will have in the years to come for the enlargement, because reforming the EU means having this kind of reflection. But we all know that federalism, apart from a few MEPs and political leaders, no one wants that. So the balance is to be found, and I think it's the evolution we have seen in the last few years with all the crises. We have more intergovernmentalism with the European Council taking more decisions, a lot of issues are put to the leaders in the European Council, so it's intergovernmentalism. But at the same time, the implementation of the decision has come to the Commission. So this is federalism. So we have both legs, in a way, nation states and the Commission. So maybe the balance is somewhere there, but being said more clearly, with more clarity on who is in charge. We had the discussions also earlier today between the European Council President and Commission's President, but also the balance between member states and the institutions. And it's not federalism; it's just being clearer on who does what and what we want collectively.
There is a question here that thank you for the slide of questions. Please send in more. That it sort of goes into, and you probably understand why I can ask it to you, Eric, as well. It's about, one of the things can be to have an EU seat, a joint EU seat at the UN Security Council. I'm asking that because of your passport, because your country has.
I was going to say, should I answer as a French?
So what about that first step? What about that a generous gesture from France saying, well, okay, let's give up our seat then and create an EU seat at the Security Council? Wouldn't that be a first great jump?
The easy answer is to say that you need to reform the status of the UN. And if you open the discussion on the seat, of course, you will have India, Brazil, and a lot of countries asking for this seat. And it's another problem being opened. But yes, it's a big, difficult question for France because, of course, we hear a lot. We are a founding member of the EU. We have a permanent seat. We have nuclear deterrence. So these are the 3 main pillars and of course the overseas territories. These are the main pillars of the French influence in the world. But even if you have a seat at the UN. I don't think it solves the problem of who speaks for, we have a high representative. He should speak for the EU, and the ambassador at the UN would not be in a better position than the high representative. So I don't think in this case, the function would create the mechanism or the agreement. It's not because we would have a seat that we would have a voice. So the right French answer would be France is there to represent the EU's interest.
That is just what I wanted to hear.
Exactly, that's why I say it. But of course, it's a limited answer. It doesn't. It's not relevant to all of the issues. first we have to agree on what the EU wants to say. I think as long as there is nothing on that, there can be no discussion on the seat.
Eric mentioned actually what's probably the core of this whole debate. What is the aim of the EU on the global stage? And I want to take you, Carlotta, and Mateusz as well. What's your answer to that? What should be the aim of the EU on the global stage? Mateusz, you go first.
I'm not sure how to answer this question. What's the aim of the United States at the global stage? What's the aim of China at the global stage? What's the aim of the EU at the global stage? I think a proper strategy is really revealed at the times of huge changes during a crisis. That's the situation. These are the circumstances when you are in fact forced to form your strategy in order to address the challenges, the threats. It's not when you don't really necessarily need to have a proper strategy when everything is all right. You need to have a proper strategy and aim as such at the global stage when there is a big crisis that challenges you. And that's maybe exactly the reason why the EU was so united with respect to what is going on in Ukraine. And that's precisely maybe the reason why it is not so united with respect to what is going on in Gaza.
So, having said that, so should the EU focus largely then on its immediate neighborhood, talking about the eastern neighborhood, maybe the Western Balkans, and perhaps care less about having a united positions on stuff like Gaza, Israel, where it's clear that positions simply are too far apart?
It's not about that you want to do something or care less about something. It's geography, it's proximity. Proximity matters in international politics. It's simple like that.
Carlotta, the aim?
I think the EU must have the necessary tools to adapt to the current situation. And I think the EU right now, the present moment, has to deal with two things. To the geopolitical competition. We have the US and we have China. We need to have a clear idea about that. What's our role? What is going to be our relationship with the US and what is going to be our relationship with China? That's the first thing. And the second one, we have to deal with the transnational challenges. I mean, pandemics, climate change, food insecurity, energy security. So I think we have these two main strategic challenge, and the EU, I think, must have the tools to adapt to the current situation, geopolitical competition, and transnational threats.
You mentioned the EU in this power struggle, can I say that, between the US and China, and Mr. Borrell famously once said, when it was still the Trump administration, that the EU has to be at equidistance between Beijing and Washington, which caused a lot of uproar at the time, I would say. It was quite a statement. But where do you place them? I know it's different and it's difficult to ask right now, but where should EU position itself on this graph between Washington and Beijing?
I mean, first of all,
because it has to put itself somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have to talk to Washington and say to them that we have similar interests, but maybe are not the same interest. And we have to try to design our own position. That it doesn't mean that we cannot cooperate with the US and we cannot cooperate with China. We need both. But it is true that our perception of China is so different from the US. So for us, China is much more about technology and markets, and also climate change. And we don't see this security level as the US. So we are less worried about Taiwan, for example, and we are not going to send vessels to the Indo-Pacific, and that's our reality as European, and we have to be very determined to that. I think we are talking to Washington, and for example, the main example is that the White House is talking about de-risking. This is a European concept. So I think we can manage, and we can be, not in between, but to deal with the US, because transatlantic relationship, I think, is so important, and at the same time, we can't try to deal with China. China is very skeptical about the US right now, and is trying to find us. We have to be very clever and take advantage of that.
You mentioned this concept of de-risking, which was von der Leyen, I believe, who said it for the first time, and now the Americans are saying de-risking instead of decoupling. So sure, that might work with Biden and Democrats to a certain extent, but again, we have the Republicans coming in, and I don't think they will talk about de-risking then. Do you? What's then? What challenges do you see?
First of all, in the US, in this polarized society and polarized political arena, the only thing where Republicans and Democrats agree is on China. China is the rival, and both parties had focused on that. And at the same time, we need to differentiate between what is the White House and the Congress. The White House is talking about de-risking and not decoupling, but the Congress no. So the problem is the people in the Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, that are very tough with China. The White House is doing another thing. So I think we need to differentiate. So at the present moment, I think it's very difficult, and Republicans are much tougher against China. So if we have a Republican president, Trump or whatever, the White House is going to be very tough against China.
Anders, what do you see? How do you see the EU position here on China? Will the EU be forced at some point to take a side, or does it have to take a side? Does it matter?
When it comes to really very difficult choices, then the position of the EU will be quite clear. And in times of crisis, we are allies with the United States. And that's, full stop. That was the case during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was lots of debates and disputes and misunderstandings between Paris and Washington. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and France were on the same line, exactly on the same line. There were intense, close consultations, especially with France. And I think this will be the case as well between the EU and the United States, when the things will go really hot, and there will be, I hope there won't be, but if there would be a crisis that will involve China. But we also need to understand that the American interests vis-à-vis China and the competition vis-à-vis China is something on an entirely different scale compared to Europe. The security interests are involved. Defense interests are involved. It was 7, maybe 6 years ago, when the whole professional military education structure in the United States was reshuffled in order to address the threat of China. Nowadays, senior officers the war colleges in the US are dealing with one primary threat, and that's China, the perception is entirely different compared to how we see the picture here in Europe, which is understandable because of a different security, defense interests. And again, there are two, if you want, superpowers, hyperpowers, to use the term of one of your compatriots, and these are the United States and China. So,
Eric, your thoughts on how the EU should manage this very delicate balance between China and US, and where it should position itself? Regardless of
the issue has different levels. The first one is on facing the rise of an autocratic power or dictatorship. So it's an issue of values. Of course, on that issue, there is no question that we have to be with the US. Then if Trump or a Trump-like president comes to the US, this values dimension may change. I don't mean Trump would be friend with China, but I mean, the Summit of Democracies and all this initiative by Biden would not have the same flavor with Trump in the White House. So we would have to see how this changes, but all this is hypothetical. So on values, we should, of course, be with the US. The big difference between the Cold War and the China challenge is the economic dimension, because with the Soviet Union, there was no economic dimension. Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was not part of the international economic and trade system. China is at the heart of it. So on economy, we have to see where European interest is, questioning US motives, because the US is our ally, our principal ally, but it's also an economic competitor, and we have seen that on many issues, tariffs, the reaction to IRA, or at least the non-consideration of the EU when IRA was designed, and how the White House and Congress reacted to the EU's astonishment of IRA. We have also the question of extraterritoriality and sanctions against European companies. So we have many examples of where the US is an economic competitor, so we cannot align behind the US on all decisions the US would take in relation to China. And there is the technological dimension with the dual use of technologies, and on that, of course, it's the EU's interest to limit the use by China of high technology that could be used militarily. For instance, it was good that this Dutch company making, these machines for chips decided to, or at least accepted the US demand not to export its machines to China. It is also in the EU's interest. But there is also the EU's interest in developing its own. We have the CHIPS Act, where the EU wants to increase its part market share in chips production. So again, does the EU interest completely align with the US interest on that domain? It's not so obvious. So the compass, to use a word that is trendy in Brussels, is to look at first at what is the EU interest, and second, before taking decisions that would align behind the US, see what will be the consequences of it. It's not only a matter of saying, okay, we are with the US against China because of values and because of economic interest, but not all US decisions relating to China would be good for the EU as well. So we have to keep that in mind.
Of course, when we talk about China, another issue, and perhaps the thing that I understand that many in the European Union and perhaps in the wider West have been sort of shocked about when it comes to the Ukraine war is the global South and the fact that they haven't really aligned, let's say, when it comes to, for example, imposing sanctions on Russia. Most of them sort of support resolutions in the UN and so on, but it seems like the EU, Europeans have been caught a bit flat-footed when it comes to perhaps winning a narrative, because it is about narratives as well in the global South, that Russia, China have been smoother there than we might have expected. And I know very well that global South is far from a homogeneous place. It's very different. So perhaps can we tease out that a bit? Like, what are you surprised about how the global South have acted in general when it comes to Ukraine? Can the European Union still play a role with the global South, you think? Or are we seen inevitably as, you know, the old colonizer that should rather just step out? Carlotta?
About the global South, I mean, when we talk about this concept, this global South is, it's like thinking it's like comparing to the West. I mean, the West and the rest. Just think that thanks to Putin, this idea of the West as a whole re-emerged, thanks to Putin, that after the Ukrainian war, the West is wider. NATO, for example, as a main example of the principal example of the West, incorporate more countries, is looking to the Indo-Pacific, is looking to the South, is improving in its defense budget, is rearming, is changing strategy. So on the one hand, we have, I think, a stronger West, and at the same time, we have a West that is becoming alone because of this global South. The global South, the majority of these countries were against the aggression of Russia, but they are not following us in the responses because they are suffering the main consequences: food security, energy security, inflation. But also, they don't follow us in this rise of China. And also, if we go back to the pandemic, if you remember how the West managed the vaccines, this was against the global South. So this is not something. This is not something new. We have to go back. It is true that right now we can hear more voices from the global South. That doesn't mean that we are weaker. I think the West is stronger, and this doesn't mean that there are not areas for cooperation. Maybe they don't follow us in some things, some responses, but we can find some areas to cooperate. And I think all these issues about raw materials, semiconductors, I think there's a space for cooperation between the EU and this global South.
Is there any particular area in the global South you think that there is more chance for the EU, for Europeans to be more successful? I think for Latin America could be a potential place where, and you know why I'm asking that as well.
As a Spaniard,
no, but it just
there was under the Spanish presidency of the Council of the European Union. This was this important meeting with Latin American countries, and I think we are doing something with Latin American countries, but we have an internal problem. I mean, in Brussels, Latin America is not an issue. I was in Brussels last week. There was a meeting, Friends of Europe, I think so, and they had, in the same, in a room, there were like several working groups, EU and the US, EU and Africa, EU, China, EU and the Pacific, no Latin America. So Latin America in Brussels is not an issue. So, for example, from the Spanish perspective, and with this presidency, we are trying to put Latin America in Brussels. So that's the main thing, the main step. And I think if we can do that, we have an opportunity. Raw materials in Chile, for example, that's something very important. We are trying to deal with that. And I'm not sure if this is, if Washington agree with this. But I mean, of course, there's an opportunity, and also this is something you have to talk to the Latin Americans, because usually they tend not to be involved in international affairs. I mean, they don't care, so they need also to do their own work.
Matusz, in Global South, is it a problem that they don't seem to follow Western moves, I would say? Both when it comes to Ukraine, but perhaps also towards China and so on. Is it a problem, or do we care too much about it? Are we strong enough without them? That's a rough question, but still.
It was in Kyoto a couple of years ago. I was traveling with my wife around Asia. We were having a discussion with a French friend who founded and ran a boulangerie in Kyoto, in Japan. And during the discussion, he told us one thing that I remember until today. He told us the world is not a supermarket. What he meant is that we tend to go around the world and tend to expect the same things as in our local supermarket around the corner. We tend to expect the same services wherever we go. We tend to expect the same attitudes wherever we go. Wherever we go, we tend to ask for the same thing and expect the same response. That's not how it works. And it's pretty natural that different countries have different interests. They have different expectations. They behave differently. We should probably more try to respect that, which doesn't mean that we should resign upon our own values. It means that we should stand firm for our values, but we cannot approach different corners of the world and expect that we will find the same things around the world all the time. The world is not a supermarket, if that might be the answer to your question.
But how come, I mean, it seems at least that the Russians, the Chinese understand that better than us. Are we just defeatist?
We are just defeatist.
Yeah, you think that they have the same issues?
I have absolutely no doubt that the West can and will strategically outperform China or Russia. I have absolutely no doubt about that from a long-term perspective. Even economically, strategically, I have full confidence in the West. I'm anything but defeatist here.
It's nice to finally hear someone say something so positive here. Like, what is that grounded in?
I think we are better able to adapt to changing circumstances. Their systems, the system of China, the system of Russia, is very rigid, and it is designed exactly to prevent adaptation. Our system, side effects of a design of our system, our liberal democracy, is that we are able to adapt better. Thanks to liberties, thanks to recurrent iterations of the election cycle, thanks to our ability to vote new leaders with new ideas, even if they are sometimes not really experienced, but even that might be an advantage. So really, we are geared better to perform better than China or Russia.
Eric, do you share this sudden dash of your optimism? And
Yeah, I do.
Can that be? But can we? Okay, you share it, but can that be somehow transposed to the Global South? Can we present a rather positive picture to them, saying that, guys, you are the one, you should listen to us, not to Beijing and Moscow?
Well, I will give two examples. The one dating from yesterday, there was the signature of the new agreement between the EU and the ACP countries, Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, 79 countries. So that's a framework for cooperation, or at least relations, with half of the UN, and that's how the EU is presenting it, which is not anecdotic. So that means that the EU continues to engage with the South. It's mainly African countries, and so it's the South. And the second example, which is half optimistic and half illustrating what I said before, is the Global Gateway Summit 2 or 3 weeks ago in Brussels. The Global Gateway is this initiative by the European Commission to create partnerships for investment in countries in Africa, in Latin America, to develop projects. It is the EU answer to the Belt and Road Initiative by China. And I'm optimistic because it's a response to what China has done with EU characteristics, meaning we are not imposing our way of doing things. We are not imposing our plans. We are not like China saying you should do this and this, and we give you the money, and if you don't repay, you will have problems. So that's how the EU is adapting. But the problem is that it has not been presented as it was just a technocratic tool after others, but it is a really new way of relating to these countries in the South. So yes, there is adaptation, there is a new way of doing things. And I see you ask me to
No, not at all. I'm sliding to the slider here. Thanks for the questions. Actually, the question that's been most upvoted is a question regarding to Cyprus and how it joined the EU despite having 40% of its territory still occupied or under its control. That probably pertains to the questions we had before on how to accept Ukraine into EU, NATO. So any of you really, like the Cyprus solution, can that be a viable solution when it comes to at least the EU entry of Ukraine? Eric, you seem
yeah, because I was having this discussion last night with one of the participants of the summit. Of course, proportionally, Cyprus is more occupied than Ukraine, but when Cyprus joined 2004, it was 30 years after the Turkish invasion, and it's really a frozen conflict in the sense that, okay, there is Turkish occupation, but I mean, there is a kind of status quo. It's not solved, but Turkey is not trying to invade the rest of Cyprus, and at that time was respecting this status quo, which is not the case with Ukraine, and we don't see with the current Russian regime how the situation could be as stable as in Cyprus. So that's. And in terms of square kilometers, of course, it's much bigger in Ukraine than in Cyprus, which is also another problem. So I think it's difficult to compare. Of course, it's the same kind of situation, but the relation with the occupying power would not be the same at all.
Mats, what do you think about this? Is it possible a Cyprus solution for Ukraine? Or is it completely two different?
Just a couple of thoughts. If there would have been shooting across the contact line / border in Cyprus, Cyprus would not have got into the EU. That's first. The second, we were both lucky and unlucky that Turkey is a member of NATO. We were lucky because it's an ally. We were unlucky because that membership problem is causing a real issue in cooperation between the EU and NATO. And the situation would have been completely different in case if Turkey was not an ally, like for example Russia, and if there had been a shooting across the contact line. then I don't think that the Cyprus would have entered the EU. And that's precisely the case for Ukraine, unfortunately, at the moment.
That brings me to another question that the audience has asked. Sort of, what that comes with NATO and Ukrainian membership? Sort of, what dangers to Europe would it bring accepting NATO, accepting Ukraine into NATO, but without the occupied territories? Is that sort of the same thing? Can that be done, or is it too dangerous for the rest of NATO? Anyone tempted to speak about the dangers of doing such a thing, but on NATO instead?
I think it is possible. It depends on Ukraine, that's first, and probably it should be the final answer. But it also depends on the hostilities across the contact line. If there won't be any hostilities, potentially that might be the case. But then we just need to think more about the adversary. So imagine yourself being a very old man with a very low strategic ability to think strategically, and you are in Kremlin, and you're seeing the process of Ukraine just getting into NATO. Let's say the accession protocol is signed, and you have a ratification process in individual member states. You have no hostilities across the contact line in Ukraine. What would you do as a leader of the Russian Federation in order to prevent the Ukraine to enter NATO and to hinder the ratification process? You will just restart the hostilities.
Shoot rockets across the line.
Exactly. Now, the problem is that if Russia wants to prevent Ukrainian entry into NATO, when we get very simple, when we oversimplify the things, unfortunately, it might be the case that Russia just can continue with the hostilities and shooting a couple of shells across the contact line indefinitely. Low scale or low level contact, low level warfare or intensity of hostilities. And I don't think we have an answer to that.
Claudia, any thoughts on this?
I think I don't see that probability in the foreseeable future. I remember when Spain became a member of NATO. For us, NATO, this was 1982, NATO was a club of democracies. So at the present moment, I mean, Ukraine is under martial law. So I think it's not possible. And secondly, I mean, you need the majority. I mean, you need the approval from each NATO country. And I'm not sure if that's possible at the present moment. I think it is not possible right now, and we have to wait, because this is a country fighting a war until under a martial law. And also, I mean, I tend to remember in 2008 with NATO summit, with George Bush, trying to convince the European allies to accept Ukraine. And it wasn't able to do that. Spain says no, France, other European countries, so we have to think about that.
On the other hand, though, in Vilnius, it seemed actually that the European countries were a bit keener to bring in Ukraine, perhaps not immediately, and the Americans were the ones who actually said no immediately. So has there been a shift there, or were just Europeans hiding behind America, perhaps? Do you have any thoughts on that? Because it seems it sort of has been a slight shift, at least, in some European capitals, that Ukraine must come into the military alliance.
I think at the present moment, I mean, the Washington, and this is not on the paper in Washington D.C. Let's see if in Washington in the next summit is going to happen, but I don't think so. I mean, we have elections. We have this problem trying to approve more funds to Ukraine. So right now it's a huge problem. I mean, it's something that the Biden administration doesn't want to talk about it.
Rick, do you want to comment on that? Or is
No, I think it's also a question of coherence for the EU. You cannot say that Ukraine is going to join the EU and start the process without saying Ukraine can join NATO, because the conditions are the same, basically. And the fact that the US is more reluctant, it's first because of internal debates and the elections that are coming, but also because in NATO everything comes in the end to the US, and in terms of managing the process and the eventual potential Russian reactions, of course it will involve the US probably more than the Europeans in terms of decisions and involvement.
There is a question here that perhaps is aimed at you, Eric, because you sort of talk about would it help to have an EU single military, or at least a single defense budget, or a joint purchase of military equipment to make an economy of scale? Would that be something that, at least as a low-hanging fruit, would be something to develop? That's perhaps something that the Americans would like the Europeans to do as well. Perhaps, I say.
Perhaps, yeah, because of course we see traditionally and recently that Europeans need to buy weapons, and of course the US is more than happy to provide them. I think it's 78% of weapons bought by Europeans since the start of the war comes from the US. So in terms of defense industry, joint procurement, of course, it's a way of having more European capabilities that can be used by Europeans in NATO. And the US is asking that. Even Trump was asking that. We didn't listen to Trump without passion when he was speaking, but when he said the Europeans have to take their part of the burden, of course, he was right that the Europeans need to invest in their defense and need to invest in common developments of capabilities and weapons. Trump wasn't saying that, but that's the conclusion the Europeans should draw from that. And all this is different from having a single, I don't know how it was said, but a single army or single...
Let's say a single budget.
A single budget.
A single European military budget.
Single without national budget, I don't think that's possible. No,
but as a top, maybe? Could that be something you think?
Well, in terms of investment, and that exists already, very small, but we are waiting for a new proposal by the Commission, and of course the trend is to have more EU money for a defense project. And what is interesting is to see that if you take the example of ASAP, the program for ammunition for Ukraine, the idea came from Estonia, and the push for that came from the Baltic states, which traditionally were the most maybe reluctant to any talk of European defense or European pillar of NATO. But now that we see it is useful for Europeans for their own security. So yeah, I think now everyone agrees. The big question is, and we see that with the Franco-German project of a new fighter jet or a new tank, it's very difficult to go beyond the national oppositions between companies, and that's another problem, I think.
I just want to mention one element that sometimes I think we miss. In Europe and in my country, in Spain, for example, politicians tend to think that, we don't like, we have these pacifist ideas, we don't want to improve our defense budget, we don't like wars, we don't like armed forces. And according to some surveys, if you ask to the Spanish public, if you want to improve your defense budget in order to contribute to the European security, they say yes. If you say NATO, because sometimes the Spanish public opinion, I mean, related NATO with the US or US militarism or imperialism or whatever, they say no. So maybe if we talk about the contribution to the European defense among European citizens, I'm sure that they are going to say yes. Maybe we need to think about it.
And again, when it comes to these sort of, because it seems like it's a lot about narratives as well, especially trying to sell something like that. So NATO, yes, but in a European way, NATO has more difficult, but European a bit more sort of could work. Do you think that, for example, when we talk about sort of fighter jets, like the Franco-German thing, could the Spanish come in there as well, you think? Is that sort of a thing? I mean, I know they are, but okay, but something else, like where because often I have a feeling that there's a weariness in the EU because something is Franco-German. And it gets something better when you put another sticker on it. Estonia, for example. Could Spain play that role?
Yes, I mean, we are trying to do so. It is true that when you talk about Europe, especially you go to Washington and you talk about Europe, they always think about France and Germany. And we say, hey, we are here in the south, a Mediterranean country, a European country, looking to the south, looking to the Atlantic, with links with Latin America. And apart from that, we are very proud of our contribution to the European defense and to NATO, because we are part of every operation, every NATO operation, and every European operation. We are, I mean, we are engaged in the Baltics since Crimea in 2014. And we are trying to push to other flanks, for example, the south. And in NATO, for example, we are trying to say that we have also a southern flank. Maybe the primary role is not going to be NATO, but maybe, yes, the European Union. So I think we try to do that. It's not easy as a middle-sized country, but yes, this is something that we are trying to do, and also with other countries and other Southern European countries, for example.
Panelists, we have about 5 minutes left, and now we need to sum up. So I would like us to do some sort of crystal ball gazing, as always. And we by some weird science, we are sitting here again in 5 years' time, talking about same thing, the European position in this geopolitical order. So we are in November 2028 right now. Will it be clearer where the European position is? Will it be a clear European position? Or were we too negative when we look back at 2023? Were we too positive? Where are we in 5 years' time? If it's too difficult, say 10. But will the EU have found itself on the global stage, or will it still consider to meander and be at the mercy of the bigger, more aggressive powers like China and United States and other global South actors? Eric, you will go first.
Okay. So 2028, it's
2030, whatever.
Okay. No, I was
we're older and grayer, that's for sure.
Elections in between, which can have a big influence, and I'm not talking only about the US. I'm talking about 2027 in France, for instance, which can have. But I would say that if all goes well, enlargement will be, I don't think for 2030, but well engaged with. The process for EU reforms. So I think the EU will be much focused on internal reforms to develop a grand strategy for the world. But it doesn't mean that it will not act, because as Carlotta said, and Matusz, it's good at reacting to crisis and adapting. So we will still have probably new decisions, new tools, and new programs. But in terms of big thinking, it will be more internal than external, I think.
Matusz, ever the optimist? Are we dominating the world in 5 years?
So it's 2030, I'm sitting here, and I'm thinking, thanks God I'm still alive. No nukes exploded in Ukraine. I think Ukraine will still not be in the EU. It will still not be in NATO. I agree with you that the EU will be preoccupied with internal reforms to prepare itself maybe for the enlargement. I think the hostilities in Ukraine will be significantly decreased. I think there will be no hostilities in 7 years. I don't think, unfortunately, that Ukraine would liberate all the territories. I think that economic stagnation in China will hit hard already by that time, so I'm very optimistic. And I don't think there will be a war anywhere close to Taiwan, luckily as well. That's it.
Quite positive, actually, somewhat. I mean, I was expecting more doom and gloom. But the boys talked about navel gazing to a certain extent, looking into sort of reforms and so on. What do you think, 2028?
I'm
30.
Optimistic by nature. 2030, I see the European Union as the indispensable partner. So, partner, we are not going to be anymore in a unipolar world. So I think the EU must try to be this indispensable partner in order to deal or to be in this geopolitical competition. We are going to manage ourselves, and then also, and I think it's even more important, the partner dealing with the transnational challenges.
So it's indispensable partner to whom? Or everyone? Or do you have some sort of selected friends?
Of course.
This indispensable partner of Europe of yours?
I mean, our relationship with the White Hat is going to be great. We are going to compete and we are going to cooperate. And the same is going to happen with China. And Latin America finally is going to have a seat or have a voice in Brussels. And we are going to deal with the Sahel. For us, it's a big problem right now. So, wonderful.
And on that wonderful note, I thank you all very much. And please give a big round of applause to our great panelists. Thank you.